is it worthwhile to invade a neutral country and kill most men and sell women into slavery? You say, well, it's an obvious choice. We know now not to do it. Well, it's not as simple as that. Even now, somebody will say, but what if we could save American lives? Lots of American lives. Then maybe we should be able to burn women to a crisp using some nuclear device, bombing some totally civilian population. Is it worthwhile? Well, it was done. So whether it was worthwhile or not is a discussion, but I just want to emphasize that these matters which we discuss are not ancient matters. And even now, as we're speaking here, there are nice, clean-cut American boys sitting next to these buttons. And if they push a button, Moscow goes poof with women and children. And St. Petersburg goes poof with women and children. And then there is a button, and should I go through the list? And of course, there's clean-cut Russian boys sitting on the other side right now, and they push, and the Silicon Valley goes poof, poof with all women and children. But maybe for a good cause, it's worth doing. Even killing a child, which would be such a dreadful thing for those of you who remember our discussion of Trojan women. But what if he would grow up as Hitler? What if we could save millions of people? Is it worthwhile killing him? And if you remember in the play, his grandmother, Hecuba, actually does say he will grow up and take revenge. So, maybe Odysseus was right. So Athenians, and that's what is very remarkable about them, right away realized there is a problem there. They didn't have a name for this problem. We would call it an ethical problem. But they did realize there is something they have to deal with. And of course, most people were practical people. They said, well, if we could save Athenian lives, yes, or, might is right, as they did say during Melian dialogue. But there was one person, at least we know of such person, and we don't know of others, who suddenly made an enormous leap. He said that, no, it is absolutely unacceptable. It is never right to do wrong. There are no circumstances which justify doing evil things. Even if we could save Athenian lives, even if we could stop tyranny, even if we could save the world, we cannot kill an innocent child. The direct killing of an innocent child is never allowed. And the name of this person is Socrates. In many respects, this one person changes the way of our civilization. Because somebody was prepared to make this statement: it's never acceptable to do wrong. In one of the meetings, which later on was described by Plato in his dialogue, Gorgias, a beautiful dialogue which raises many fundamental ethical issues, he, after sort of a light start, Plato was always sort of wandering around, or maybe Socrates was always wandering around. In some sense, we will be discussing where is Plato, where is Socrates in the next lecture. A warning, by the way, there is a German professor, at least there was in 19th century, who said that Socrates didn't say what he said and Plato didn't write what he wrote. So please don't send me emails saying that you just discovered such a statement. But I'm trying to present to you things which I believe actually happened. For sure, there were things which everybody for 2,400 years believed happened. And that's more important than historical truth. I have absolutely no doubt that what I'm talking about did happen. Socrates did say that under no circumstances you should do things like that. And as he says in Gorgias, and these are his direct words, that it's better to suffer evil than to do evil, always, unconditionally. Well, it didn't go well with the audience. He was actually, when he was saying it, he was in a house of a corporate executive or whatever, something like a pretty close to a corporate executive, whose name was Callimachus, a very practical guy. You know how they are. Some of you aspire to be them. So he actually became quite mad. And of course accused Socrates in being mad. Socrates, you are mad, you are joking. This cannot be true. He says, there is a long speech. I was actually planning to read you the speech, but then I realized that there are time constraints. So read it yourself. There is this. A speech by Callimachus is very, very compelling. Callicles. So Callicles is the executive. So in any case, what he says is that this is all childish nonsense. This is not how the world works. The world works is only weak people, nobodies. They believe in all these rights, in all this good and evil. The real people ignore that. The real people do what they have to do what must be done. And this is just talk for the weak. Because, we have to placate the weak. We have to explain to them that, they have rights and there's something like justice. No, this is all nonsense. Even gods do not believe in that. They just enforce what they can, what they want. So the will, the might is right. That is what is the fundamental fact. And it's hard to argue. A few lectures back, somebody would say, so what if you don't do it? So Socrates gives a speech. At the end, he often gives speeches. In many books, especially modern books by people who try to explain to you who Socrates was, they say Socrates was the guy who invented Socratic method. He didn't really believe in anything but questioned authority. Well, he did question wrong authority, but he did believe in many, many things, as becomes clear if you attempt to read the texts. And he often gave speeches where he actually talked about some fundamental things. And so how does he answer Callicles? Indeed, it's probably childish tale. And in his speech he says, yes, let me tell you what I believe. You will think it's a fable, but I, he continues, believe that it's a very important myth, very important story. You see, fable, myth, they're different. What he says, let me tell you how the world is structured. Eventually, you will die. Executive types do not believe that they'll die. They'll live forever and move into the cloud now. But again, sort of, even at that time, the thought of death was not something they would easily face. And Socrates says, you will die, and when you die, you will be judged. Here we come to the first ever, at least in the history of the Western civilization, idea of judgment. That at the end of life, here it goes. Remember when Solon was talking that you are not certain whether your life is good or bad till you die. And Socrates completes that, because you will be certain only at the moment of judgment. And he describes what many of us would recognize as familiar story. He says there are people who committed terrible crimes. They're usually tyrants in important corporate management. This is what he says. And they will go to hell, where they will remain forever. He tells other stories in other places, but that's the story he tells there. There are people who committed bad things, and they're just ordinary people. People like us, I hope we're ordinary people, who, after suffering for a while, will be released and join the blessed. And then they'll be truly righteous, the philosophers, people. Again, for him, philosophers does not mean professors of philosophy, not at all. There are professors of philosophy in Greece at that time. They're called sophists. No, he's talking about philosophers, lovers of wisdom. It was a new word. People who really love wisdom, who are prepared to dedicate their life to wisdom. And these people will go to the place of the blessed. Elysian fields. Yes? Not Paris. Better place. So some of you might say, oh yes, he's talking about hell, purgatory, and heaven. And so he does, in a very dogmatic way. And he says, well, and if you don't believe it, he continues, you'll be very surprised. You'll be slapped in the face when you face this reality. Again, the direct quote. From Socrates. This was his message. Now, let me, before we discover how the society reacted to his message, it reacted in a very direct way, let me describe Socrates. We know a lot about him, in spite of these 19th century people who tell me know nothing. We know mostly, direct evidence comes from two books, a very big book by his disciple Plato. It's a huge book. And a little book by his disciple Xenophon. Right? This describes somewhat different person from this. Obviously, Socrates had a Protean, changeable personality. When talking to people of limited intelligence, he was addressing them on a different level. For example, apparently he advised Xenophon on things of household economy. An important subject indeed, but maybe not as central to his teaching as all of that. So we know quite a bit. In many respects, I feel that I know more about Socrates than about most contemporary figures. I know how he looked. And, well, let me tell you, he didn't look too good. He was short, bow-legged, with a strange sideway gait. Sort of, he was. By the time these people met him, he acquired what we would call beer belly. You know, he was quite strong, because apparently, even when he was not young, he could wrestle. For Greeks, wrestling is a major activity with young and strong and beautiful people, and maybe win. He was a great soldier, participated in several major battles, and apparently quite heroically saved people's lives in 432, during the Battle of Potidæa, he saved Alcibiades, whether a famous Greek politician. Whether it was a good thing or not, that's another story. Alcibiades was not a simple person, as any successful politician. So, but he did save him. There is a direct evidence, at least as far as I'm concerned, of that. He was not afraid of the enemy. He was not afraid to die. And he was a very good fighter by all accounts. His face was unbelievably ugly. Bald, with large bulging eyes. He remarked once that he could see much better than other people because he had sort of three-dimensional vision because they were sort of sticking out. Whether it was true or not, that's what he said. So he did have bulging eyes. A nose which was remarkable both by its size and by upturned nostrils. So to smell you better. And a large mouth with, again, bulging lips. So not a picture of a beautiful thing. It probably would remind you of a frog if you look at his surviving busts. He does. So he was quite ugly, but he was extremely popular with a beautiful society. You have to understand that most Greeks at that time, whatever their sort of sexual orientation was, would chase after beautiful boys. Boys were late teens. They were not boys. But it was considered to be socially very, very good to be in love with one of these beautiful boys. And Socrates would publicly say that he is in love with beautiful boys, and especially with Alcibiades, this rising politician, who was probably the most beautiful boy in Athens, maybe the entire Greece. We do have surviving busts, and oh yes, he was very beautiful. And also very athletic and beautiful body and whatever. The remarkable thing that according to the testimony of Alcibiades, when eventually he himself decided to chase after Socrates and seduce him, which was very unusual. It was supposed to be that a senior person will be seducing the boy. And it was highly regulated. Society did not allow any, for example, while their sexual intercourse of sorts was expected at some point after the boy was cultivated, it couldn't be either, sorry for going into details, but either anal or oral. Only intercrural between the thighs was allowed. It was very regulated. So at some point, I need it for the story, Alcibiades decides to seduce Socrates. And he is rich and famous. He invites him to his house, and they get drunk. And he says, "Oh, it's late. You cannot go home." And Socrates says, "All right, okay, I'll sleep here on the bench." And Alcibiades gets under the blanket right there to the guy who's supposedly in love with him. And then, as he says in his wonderful speech, Alcibiades, which reported by Plato, he says that when I woke up, it was as if I slept with my father. Nothing happened. So apparently he was very strange. He was in love with boys, but as he apparently said himself, mostly with their minds. Right? So lots of young boys from high society would chase after him. He was extremely popular. because he was unlike anybody else they ever met. He was very poor, dirt poor. There was just about nobody in Athens as poor as he was. You say, how poor? Well, there are some little details we know. He had torn tunic. He had one mantle. It was short and threadbare. We do know that he had sandals. But what we do know also, that he never wore them because only on special occasions. This was an expensive thing for him to wear sandals. Trust me, everybody in Athens had sandals. People were astonished at his poverty. Moreover, during these military expeditions, when he went to northern Greece, where it could be quite cold, he would walk barefoot in the snow. All other soldiers were astonished. Because, he was saving his sandals. He left them in Athens. He had only one pair. He wouldn't take. He had all the richest friends, all the rich people were his friends. He would not take any money. For him, it was a matter of principle. Never take money for wisdom. There were these teachers of wisdom, sophists, who would travel from place to place. They'll give lectures and get paid very generously. Some would become extremely wealthy by explaining to people how to prove your case. Observe the difference. Socrates didn't care about proving the case. He cared about discovering what's true and standing for that. These people, they were like lawyers. These were, places. And in Greek, in a democratic society, this is not Persia after all. You had to be well-educated to defend your point of view, because that's what, if you accused someone, you had to accuse him before the assembly. If you were accused, you had to defend yourself. Right? You could hire someone to write your speech, but you had to have skills to at least convey the speech to that. A strange person wouldn't take the money for wisdom. He actually eventually comes to a point when asked that he had no wisdom, nothing to peddle. He was just trying to discover the truth. He was not a sophist. He was a philosopher, a lover of wisdom. He didn't claim to have it. So he did have a wife. That was sort of strange because, it meant expense. He was poor. And he had 3 children, highly unusual for an Athenian, too many. Yes, Nick, even then. But he got married quite late, probably when he was around 50. And some people say it's not quite clear that he got married because Athens lost lots of people during the war, and he felt that he was morally obligated to get a wife and children as a citizen. For him, the notion of moral obligation, for the first time we encounter that, was extremely important, as we shall see. So his wife, while we know little about her from Plato, here comes Xenophon, who gives us a little snippet of Socrates' domestic life. Socrates' wife, and everybody knew that, used once upon a time, was called Xanthippe. So Xanthippe was, by all accounts, the only account we actually have is, Xenophon was a terrible shrew. She would just not let him do anything without, there are wives like that, at least Greeks had them, maybe not now, but who would not let you just do anything. At least one story much later, and probably not exactly, Alcibiades sends him a beautiful cake. What does she do? She throws on the ground and stamps on it. Typical, sure. So this is one of his friends asks, so if that's your view, Socrates, how does it come that you don't practice what you preach by yourself educating Xanthippe, your wife, but live with a wife who is the hardest to get along with of all the women there are? Yes, of all that ever were. That's a very strong statement, I suspect, or ever will be. So apparently a terrible wife. Again, I don't think Xenophon was the smartest person there was, but he knew Socrates. That's undeniably. And that's a famous reply. Because Socrates replies, I observe that men who wish to become expert horsemen do not get the most docile horses, but rather those that are high-mettled, believing that if they can manage this kind, they will easily handle any other. My course is similar. Mankind at large is what I wish to deal and associate with. And so I have got her, well assured that if I can endure her, I shall have no difficulty in my relations with all the rest of humankind. So as later on, about 800 years after that, St. John Chrysostom, a famous Greek preacher, in his homily on the first, one of his homilies on the first letter of Corinthians, says that learn from him. He married such a wife so that even at home he could learn philosophy. So indeed, that's a great thing to do if he did. So he had such a wife, so he had such opinions. You have to do what is right. So what happens? When he goes around Athens, starts conversation, asks people about all kinds of things, a bunch of especially well-to-do kids, because they don't have anything else to do, you know, they follow him and try to learn. And more people become annoyed. They become so annoyed, and again, some of these young people become like Alcibiades, important politicians who later betray Athens and go to Sparta and do all kinds of terrible things. So they blame their supposed teacher. He is accused of atheism, of teaching people to his young people to disregard the laws, and of all other kind of malicious activity. Was he an atheist? In some sense, yes, if you mean he didn't believe in superstitions. He was extremely averse, and one of the sayings which could be attributed to him, he talked about three kinds of atheists: theoretical atheists, people who deny the existence of God; practical atheists, people who do not deny the existence of God but behave as if he did not exist; and finally, religious atheists, people who think that they could always buy their way out. So if you don't, I'll do what I please and then I'll build a hospital or donate money for Jewish community center or whatever, good things. And all my misdeeds will be obviously forgiven. So he despised the third kind. He didn't like the first and second kind either, but he particularly disliked the third kind. The so-called religious people who would try to buy the way out. He was clearly not just a believer, he was a mystic, if you know what it is, the person who talks to God. How do we know it? Well, we know it from two sources. From outside people who, for example, describe one situation during a military campaign. He spends 24 hours, actually literally 24 hours, in a state of contemplation, standing outside in the cold and contemplating the truth. And then at the end, when the sun arises, the day passes, the night passes, next morning comes, the sun arises, and he greets it in prayer and goes and does whatever his business is. And then we know it from him. He explicitly says that he had this voice from childhood, as he says. I had this daemonic voice. Do not view this daemonic as demonic in contemporary sense. Angelic, prophetic voice, which would stop him every time he would attempt to do something wrong. He would clearly hear this voice. So not just not an atheist, a mystic. And as he says himself quite directly, that this voice stopped him from ever getting involved in politics. And as he continues, and that is good, because if I did, I wouldn't have lived long. And yes, it's clearly so. Even in these wonderful direct democracies such as Athens, he wouldn't have lived, and he was in trouble several times before. Finally, they called him, and the totally bogus charges. Everybody knows they're bogus. But he's condemned, found guilty. But there is the next stage, the penalty stage. So he gives another speech. He says, what penalty you should give me? Yeah, my opponents, the persecution, asking for death penalty. And I think that you should give me a different penalty. There is this free meals for famous people, which you offer if you win Olympic Games. There was this free meal which the city would offer you. You should give it to me every day for the job I do for the city. Well, didn't work too well. Even more people voted for the death penalty than people who voted for him being guilty. And then again, I was planning to read it. I don't think I can. His concluding speech. Basically, he says, look, if he wanted to hurt me, he could not hurt me. I didn't do anything wrong. Only the person, again, this is his position. Only the person who does wrong is hurting himself. Outside people cannot hurt you. There is no way they could hurt you as long as you do not do wrong. And you say, I'm going to die, but we don't know if it's a bad thing. How do we know? And he says there are two possibilities. Maybe it is just eternal dark sleep. But he continues. Think about a night when you had a really good sleep and didn't have any dreams. Wasn't it beautiful? Wasn't it the happiest night which you ever had? And you would get that as your reward forever. It is wonderful. But, he continues, maybe it's not what you will get. Maybe you will go and meet other people. You go to this other world, and there I will meet Homer. I will meet Odyssey. I'll meet all the people we want to meet. It's not a bad thing. It's a wonderful thing, he continues. Now, his friends are decimated. They think that it would be a tragedy for Athens. It would be a tragedy for them if he's killed. And believe it or not, the state does not really want to execute him. He is the most famous Greek now alive. So, killing him is not going to be very sort of PR, whatever thing to do. No. So his friends, Crito, specific friend, comes to him and say, look, we arranged everything. We pay these people, and you could move to Thessaly. I have friends there. You would have a great life. You will take care of your kids. He has 3 kids, young kids. At least 2 of them are young. 1 is a teenager. Everybody will be happy. And here comes his answer. He says, no, I cannot do that. Apparently, he says, if I do so, I will be against the laws. And then again, a great speech by Socrates about our relation to the laws. He believed in what we would later call, at the time of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, we would call social contract. We have this contract with the laws, with the state. And he says, isn't it a wonderful contract? Isn't the state protect us? Didn't it allow us to get our education, to grow up, to be citizen? You cannot violate the laws, one law, without breaking them all. You have to obey the laws. And this is, again, the position which everybody knows that breaking the law, if you could gain something, is sort of an honorable thing to do, especially if nobody is watching. He says, no, you cannot do it, I will not do it. So, in some sense, here is the person who doesn't just believe that might is not right, that right is might. But he's prepared to prove it with the most convincing proof by accepting this terrible, unjust punishment from the state. For those of you who want to read it, and of course you must read it, but life is tough. There are things to do. His speech before the court is preserved beautifully by both. Don't read this one. He wasn't even present. He was in Persia. Read this one, Plato. It's one of the most beautiful things ever written. This dialogue with Crito is called, believe it or not, Crito, and it's also written by Plato, and it describes this argument whether you should escape. As a good person, it's an unjust punishment. Shouldn't you escape? Again, very firmly, no. And then we have another beautiful dialogue, a lengthier, more difficult dialogue called Phaedor, or Fedor, or Theodor, depending on your Greek pronunciation. Modern Greeks would say Fedor correctly. Where the narrative is of his last hours, his friends to come to his cell in jail to help him go to the next step. The Athenians used hemlock, a poison which you're supposed to die. And of course, they're all crying. And it's pretty amazing thing because he has to say, just stop crying. I mean, I should be crying, not you. And you wouldn't let me just pass along. By the way, what does he do while he's waiting in jail for the execution? He occupies himself in putting to verse Aesop's fables. And many of us would pay, I couldn't say how much money. It's not more than we have, but close, to have this. They, sadly enough, they haven't survived. He never wrote any philosophical things, but he did write poetry, at least during the last days of his life. That's what he was occupied. It's very clear from whatever we know about him, he was wonderfully well educated. So it's not that he was an illiterate stonecutter, as some people say, you know the country. But he didn't write. So at the end, again, he spends time with his disciples who are crying, explaining to them that's not a tragedy. And he proves to them in multiple ways. He gives different theories, different convincing proofs. They're not mathematically convincing, but they're quite beautiful, about immortality of the soul. And again, it's one of the most beautiful dialogues ever written. We will be talking about Plato and his dialogues the next lecture. But at least these three dialogues on the death of Socrates should clearly be something which every civilized person should read. And the one which I mentioned in the beginning, Gorgias, is another dialogue without which you cannot understand these three, because you cannot understand why he got to this point. And just to tell you something pretty interesting from my point of view, of course, obviously people around him, these power people, were predicting his demise for many, many years. There is a remarkable passage in the beginning of the second book of the Republic, his great dialogue, which Plato wrote over many years, where Glaucon, sort of Socrates' opponent in the dialogue, tries to explain to him that all this talk of justice is just a bunch of hogwash. He says, let's imagine, he says, that you could be just. Let's imagine that there is a just person. And let's think what will happen to him. And here there is this, from my point of view, a rather remarkable passage. A just person in such circumstances will be scourged, stretched on a rack, chained, blinded, and at the end, when he has suffered every kind of evil, he'll be crucified. This is written about 400 years before events which we'll discuss later, which happened in Palestine. And it's not a Christian interpolation, no matter what you might think. That concludes our story of Socrates. We'll be talking about Plato next time. So the title for the lecture, by the way, Socrates, the Just Man.